Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of SuperCoach, mates. Well, we hope you all had a great Christmas and New Year. Um, we are currently recording in 38-degree heat, so if we if we are a bit tired and a bit worn out, that's why. As per normal, I am joined by Thomas. How are you going, Thomas?
Yeah, not too bad. Got stuck in a car with the aircon not really working, so that was frustrating. But good to be in a room with a bit of aircon in this heat. But hopefully that doesn't affect our pod so far. But yeah, good to be back after the new year. And good to get cracking.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through some players who, let's just say, shut the bed in 2025, and see if we think that they can rebound back in 2026. So I'm going to hand you over now to Thomas, who's going to take you through a list of players who are disappointed in 2025 and whether or not we think they can bounce back next year or this year.
Yeah, so this is a list obviously compiled by ourselves, and I put a kind of a poll out, not a poll out, but a question on Twitter to see if you guys, any players that you were interested in us discussing, whether or not they had a disappointing year or they stagnated, or essentially what we're looking for is players that are ready to rebound, and hopefully you can grab them at a cheaper price if you do think they're going to rebound successfully. There's a few players in the list that I've got in my team, and I'm sure we will have in our community team, as I posted our initial community team earlier on in the week. But the first play off the bat, I'll leave this one entirely up to Nathan first because he's probably got the most intel about it, which is Dan Houston. Now, obviously, he was one that was touted to be, quite successful last year as a big prize recruit for the Pies. Didn't quite work out that way. I think he was priced above 500k last year, coming off basically an All-Australian from Port Adelaide and was basically their best player. But what are your thoughts on why he kind of shut the bed, Nathan? Because obviously you'd be disappointed as a Pie supporter that you didn't probably get the best out of Dan Houston. Do you reckon you guys will rectify that this year, or do you reckon he's kind of now just going to be that regular halfback that doesn't really do much in comparison to when he was at Port where he was, dominating?
Yeah, well, I mean, it took Lockie Schultz 12 months to get going when he made the move from Fremantle to Collingwood. So I'm hoping that Dan Houston can do the same thing. Obviously, yeah, as obviously being a Collingwood supporter, I have frustratingly watched him firsthand just disappear. Safe to say. So, I think he has to be that designated player off halfback. I think Josh Dacos was that
Yep.
player last year at Collingwood.
Yep.
By all reports, I've heard that Josh Dacos is perhaps moving further up the field, sort of back to a wing or even a midfield role. So I think that if that's the case, I think Houston will become their designated sort of halfback launcher. So if he can get back to that, well done. I wouldn't be touching him with a barbed wire though, just because I don't know how he's going to go. But for
Yep.
my sake and for Collingwood's sake, I hope that he can get back to that sort of 2024 form, where he was all Australian and was one of the best players off that halfback flank in the league.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think Josh Dacos really negatively impacted Houston to a big degree. I think I hoped as a potential owner last year, I never picked him, but he was going to be that guy off halfback that took the monopoly kickouts and really dictated that halfback line, like he did at Port Adelaide, and you just assumed potentially in a better side that would happen, but obviously not to be. And as Nathan pointed out correctly, I think Josh Dacos really impacted his output. But if Josh Dacos does get pushed back up a more traditional winger rather than rolling back into that kind of extra defender, then maybe Houston becomes that dominant halfback that we all hoped he was last season. As Nathan said, I wouldn't touch him until you see that quite consistently. I would even be willing to just wait it out in the first few opening rounds and just see how he progresses. He does have the early buys, so I guess there's no real rush. I don't think you're losing out too much unless he goes berserk in the first couple rounds. But Houston's never been that player to consistently score that heavily. And I think we've got a lot of players around that 400 to 450k mark that I think Houston's not a priority to bring in. But moving on to the next player, this is someone that's been disappointing for, I guess, almost 2 seasons now. And that's Tom Stewart. I guess this kind of coincided with Geelong's transition from what I saw as a chip mark kind of game, which I know St Kilda really struggled to play against, to a really just gung-ho attack with Smith and Holmes. What are your thoughts, Nathan? Are you touching, or do you reckon we should touch Stewart at all, or is he just a no-go now that, you know, you've got Holmes playing off halfback, you've got Ollie Dempsey rolling down off the wing to help out. Like, there's a lot of avenues they're going now with the Cats that have probably changed the dynamic as where they were a couple seasons ago, as dominant as they were. What are your thoughts on Stewart? Is he a no-go for you?
Yeah, look, I know a lot of people have, written Geelong off, but look, I think history says that they're not going to win a finals match this year, Geelong. So with that in mind, I don't know how they're going to go. So I think he's still going to score well. He's still going to be Geelong's main guy off the halfback. So I can't see that score, that average dropping below 90 still. So I'm not saying don't pick him. I'm just not sure how Geelong as a whole are going to go this year. So I think that's probably more where I'm coming from in saying to not pick him. Yep. But yeah, if you do decide to pick him, I don't think he's going to drop away that much. But I just think that, history is a great guide, and sides who have been belted in grand finals have struggled the next season to, make the finals. Obviously, we saw that with Sydney last year. They got belted in 24, and then they, struggled really badly last year. So, with that, there always comes a risk. So, I think that's sort of my stance on Geelong, and probably Tom Stewart as well. I'm just not sure how they're going to go in 2026.
Yeah, I do agree. I think if you look at his stat line, in 2023 average, that's when I think he got his All-Australian blazer, average of 113, and then declined since 2024's average of about 96.7, or rounded up to 97, and then 2025 an average of about 93. So it's just gone down since. I guess he's had a pretty bad run with bad injuries at the wrong times, which has really stagnated his score. But I think, as Nathan said, he's not getting any younger, and I think Geelong are more on the decline a little bit for the time being. I know they've been super impressive over a long period of time, but I don't think with the amount of defenders we have this season that are really ready to rise up to the next category, I think you're safer picking those than Stewart, who is almost becoming, rather than the general down halfback where he gets a lot of the ball, he's becoming more of a lockdown kind of traditional halfbackman. So yeah, I'd probably stay away from Stewart. And before we move on to the midfielders, got 2 more defenders left. I'll probably keep these short and sweet because they're not really worth talking about too much, but they're always apparent in preseason teams. That's Jaden Short and Jordan Ridley. I guess it'd be interesting to hear your sentiment on this, Nathan, because for me it's pretty short and sweet. Jaden Short, please don't get sucked into picking him every season. He somehow gets 160 odd SuperCoach points in the first preseason game, and everyone goes, "All right, we've got to lock him in." You just got to be aware, I guess, that sometimes in these preseason games the pressure is a lot lower than what it is come round one, and halfbacks traditionally get a lot of points in those matches just because the pressure is a lot lower down. And Short, I think we all hoped that he was going to be almost a premium-like player because of how much ball was going to go down Richmond's end, and he's a leader down back, so maybe that was going to differ to how he normally scores, but didn't really eventuate with Short. I think it's a double-edged sword with that kind of situation where the ball comes down a lot and there's a lot of pressure coming down the Richmond back line. So I think a lot of his disposal was quite rushed, and I think Ridley, he's been a super coach pick pretty consistently in previous years, but I think that's past his time now. I think Ridley's is too injury prone, and Essendon have a lot of young halfbacks coming through the ranks, and I think they're going to prioritise their development over someone like Ridley, who is quite injury prone. And as much as he's a really good user of the ball, I think that they're transitioning to something similar to Geelong, where they're just playing really fast and aggressive, and they're not caring too much about who has the ball and they're trying to get it forward. What are your thoughts on these two, Nathan? Because obviously there'll be people out there that see this price and they're very, very enticing at that price. But I guess, as I said beforehand, there's a lot of other players around that mark that are quite enticing as well.
Yep, I'll agree with what you said. Hard avoid both of these two. I've been sucked into both of these guys in the past, and they are firmly on my never again list. So I don't have anything more to add to that. I will probably never be picking those two again, no matter how good they are.
Yeah,
and that's basically all I have to say on that.
Yeah, I think you're better off risking the safe option, or basically avoiding the risk by playing it safe and avoiding those two. Before we move on to the mids, the other one that I know people brought up was Nick Newman. He came off. We talked about this in my team picker last episode, but he's one we'll briefly touch over. He obviously came off that ruptured Achilles or whatever it was, patella tendon injury. So he's one that, I guess, if he's back at full fitness and has a full preseason, he's one to keep an eye on as really someone that can really dominate 2026. He's got a monopoly off halfback, I guess, in the Blues lineup, but I guess it's a really wait and see with how his health progresses. But moving on to the mids, as we've said in my team picker video last week, I guess the mids is a make or break for a lot of teams. If you don't get this part right, it can really impact your score because there's where the mids, the points in the midfield are the most valuable. But having said that, there's a fair few players in here, and I kind of whittled it down to a top 5 that present a lot of value for what they're worth. Obviously, we talked about Darcy Parish and Hayden Young last week as options, but these 5 in particular are priced under 600k, so you're not breaking the bank to get them, and they're all capable of scoring, 110 plus. But kicking off the ball with a Sydney star, we talked about him last week, so I believe he was in my side, Errol Goulden. He's priced unders, I think, a little bit because he came off that nasty ankle injury and it didn't play many games. And he only played at 10 games, averaged about 104 in those games. I think he's ready to bounce back. I don't know if I mentioned this last episode, but I remember in a broadcast I was watching with Sydney playing, the commentators mentioned how much Sydney rely upon Goulden's A, leadership, but B, ball in hand, and he dictates a lot of their play. And it's kind of been a reason why someone like Jake Lloyd has not been a super coach stud as he has in previous seasons. I think they're avoiding, similar to Geelong, that chip mark zone. They really want to get in the hands of their ball users like a Blakey, a Goulden, a McInerney, where they can really run and gun. And Goulden's such an elite kick that I think they really want the ball in his hands. What are your thoughts on this, Nathan? Obviously, he's priced. He's going to be the price the highest of the lot I pick, but is he one that you're pretty keen on locking in?
Look, I'm just going to say this now. I think if there's anyone who was impacted by injury last year, I don't think they deserve to be on this. That's just my thing, because I think there's a real difference between someone who was impacted by injury and someone like Houston who just genuinely did shit the bed. To put it kindly. So I think I'll repeat what I said on the last podcast about Goulden. I think he's a great pick. I think he's probably about 30 to 40k under where he should be. Definitely was impacted by injury. So as long as he gets through preseason, I see no reason why Sydney can't jump out of the gun like they did in 2024. They finished the season very well last year. They actually kind of remind me a bit of what Collingwood did in 2024. They lost their first few games. They were out of the finals race quite early, and then they came storming home, and we saw the start that Collingwood made last year.
Yep.
Where they were 12-2. I can see Sydney doing that exact same thing, where they just jump out of the blocks. So I think Goulden is someone who you should strongly consider. Because I think Sydney's draw, I had a look at it. I think they've got Brisbane in round 1. I wouldn't be surprised if they actually won that game. And then I think their other games they have are quite, winnable games. So I wouldn't surprise me if they got off to a good start. So, yeah, I will definitely strongly consider Goulden at that 566,000 price.
Yeah, I think you've got to just be careful, just to caveat to what Nathan said. They have got, before that Brisbane game, they've got that opening round fixture against Carlton, which means they've got to buy in round 5, I think it was, that I checked. So just be wary, or maybe round 3, sorry. Just be wary of that buy if you are loading up on buy heavy players. You just want to be careful that you're not loading up on too many. Next, moving on, is someone that definitely did have a down season, or maybe not a full down season, but definitely one that was disappointing in large patches. And he's now mid only, which I guess this really skews his ability to be picked in the midfield. Is Chad Warner. I know I had him in my side as a forward, and he was definitely impressive in patches, but I think he's one that fluctuates so much that there's almost no point getting him, especially in the mid. You want someone that's consistent. Warner, especially with Goulden back in the side, I think is the first one to leave that midfield. He does provide, he's probably one of the few Sydney midfielders that can provide some real damaging attack through the midfield and push forward and kick goals. Having said that, he's a tag threat. And it just seemed last season that every time it didn't go the way for the Swans, Warner was the first one to be impacted, whether or not that was because he was tagged or he just wasn't getting the ball. But it just seemed that when it wasn't going the Swans' way, he was nowhere near it. And I think the last thing you want is, getting scores of a 30 and 40, which he was capable of doing as a forward, and by no means that might happen as a mid. Do you reckon that will be the similar kind of trend this year, Nathan, or do you reckon in lieu of kind of the Swans rise back up the ladder, that will really help Warner get back to, an uber premium?
Well, I have no doubt that if Sydney are going to go back up, Warner's going to be a big part of that rise up. Look, I think as a midfield only, there's probably better options at that price.
Yeah.
I definitely would have strongly considered him if he was a forward, but I think being a midfield only hurts him.
Yeah.
So at this stage, it's a no. I think I'd rather Goulden or Heaney over Warner, just because of that fluctuation of scores. So yeah, I think at this stage Warner's a no, but if he gets forward eligibility later on in the year, then perhaps I would consider it as a forward, but not at this stage, I don't think.
Yeah. No, I do agree. 100% agree with you, Nathan. I think he's a hard pass. Just there's a lot of players, well, not a lot, but a few players that are probably better options and even cheaper, like your Parishes and Youngs, that are less risk-free, I guess. But as Nathan said, if he gets forward eligible, there's not too many forwards this year that are really screaming pick me, so he could be one that could be bumped forward, but I wouldn't pick him to start with, especially if you're going to go Goulden anyway. The next two we talked about quite heavily in my team picker last year because I had one of the two, and Nathan's quite bullish on the other, but the first one goes to Jack Steele and the second one goes to Clayton Oliver. I'll let you talk about Oliver, Nathan, because I know you're really looking forward to how Oliver will suit the Giants. Steele, I've had a bit of not backlash, but I guess a bit of to and fro with how he's going to go in the D's. Look, I think I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think a big reason why he wasn't in that midfield mix towards the end of the year was the rise of how Naz is a full-time mid now, bar when he gets tagged, and Windhager was a big reason why Steele got pushed out. So Windhager was pretty much on the ropes of not being in a best 22, and then all of a sudden in the last month of footy, he really dominated. And I think that really impacted Steele, and Steele's never really been the same since his shoulder and knee injuries. He's never really quite recaptured that form. But having said that, he was, serviceable up forward. I think there were talks that if he did stay at St Kilda, he was going to play, a hybrid half forward. And I guess for him as a personal kind of development or continued development as a leader, he wanted to play full-time mid. And I guess with the D's losing Truck and Oliver, that made a perfect mix for Steele. And he's never been a bad player. SuperCoach wise, I think he just didn't get that opportunity when we pushed him out of the midfield. And having said that, he's got the midfield to his own now. I think he's going to really help as a leader, like the likes of Langford in there, Kazai Pickett or Trent Rivers. And as I said last week, or last episode, I think Gawn is really going to assist Steele, because Marshall playing that sole ruck last season really isn't a tap ruckman, so Steele never really got the best ball in his guts, in his hands, and I think Gawn with his huge hit out to advantage statistics is really going to help and assist Steele, and for sure I think personally I'm pretty bullish on Steele. I picked him as a Saints supporter for many years, but I think as a Melbourne player now, I think he can really hit a good average and have a good bounce back. And yeah, really looking forward to what Steele can offer for the Ds. But I'll leave that for another time as well. But what are your thoughts on Oliver, Nathan? I know I put it out on Twitter in our community side. I saw a lot of people said, get rid of Oliver. He's not good enough, or he's past his best. There's better players around that mark. What are your thoughts on Oliver? Because I know you're very bullish on how he's going to fit in the Giants' best 22 next season.
Yeah, well, I just think for Oliver, I just think a change of environment could possibly bring the best back out of Clayton Oliver. I mean, we know he's a talented player. Yes, I do agree that the game is sort of moving away from his type of player. And I don't know how Tom Green is going to necessarily impact Oliver's his rotations and stuff, because I think they probably are quite similar in the way that they play. So I think there are genuine, perhaps question marks over Clayton Oliver, but then you go back through his past, and if you take out the last, couple of years and stuff, he's a consistent 100-point player. He doesn't need a lot of disposal because he can win his own ball.
Yeah.
So I just think that's the appeal for Oliver at that sort of. I think from my perspective, it's more probably about the price as opposed to actually, a genuine desire to actually, strongly consider picking him. I just think that a player of his class at $500,000. This is a guy who's averaged 115 before in the season, and if you remove the name, you would say that at that price, to get him for $500,000 for someone who can average 115 is, arguably a steal.
Yep.
And then to, put a name to it perhaps does do it a little bit of disservice. So I just think that if he can get himself mentally right, I think the move out of the Melbourne football bubble will be a huge plus for him. For some people, they just don't cope well with that bubble. And, moving to a place where you can be a bit more anonymous perhaps might be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing. So hopefully we see the good side of it for Clayton Oliver's sake. Because, I think if he can break into that Giants midfield, I definitely think that there can be a spot there for him. If he can get himself mentally right. And if he can get himself right, who knows where that, that average of 92.5 can go. So, I think at this stage, it's probably the best move to perhaps have that just slight hesitation for him. He might even be a good watch list player at this stage. Someone who you just, you sort of haven't removed, but you can sort of keep your eye on and see how he goes. And if he can prove himself right, that could be a good move, because I think that opening round I don't think counts again for SuperCoach. So he basically has a free crack. If he does well in the opening round, then you might consider him. Otherwise, pass on him.
Yeah, I don't know, my gut feel tells me that we're going to have to be really strict and only pick one, maybe two of these 500k players. Again, these early buys are really going to sting, I think, because there's a lot of good players this time around in these teams. Oliver, I think, you're right. in saying that I think he's going to really benefit from a fresh start outside of that Melbourne bubble. I guess there's always that risk of his mental health kind of dwindling again and showing up, and who knows how that will impact his footy. But I think a move to outside of Melbourne to Western Sydney is going to really help him. I think the main concern from a footy perspective is, you've already got Tom Green, who's the extractor in that midfield. How does that impact Oliver, who did pretty much the same job at the Ds? Having said that, Josh Kelly's, I think, injured pretty much for a lot of the 2026 season, so there's a midfield spot up for grabs. Oliver really can't play anywhere else or shouldn't play anywhere else. I think he does his best footy in the mids, and I think he's definitely an accumulator as well as an extractor, so I think that's going to really help him at the Giants. They've got a really, really good midfield around him, and I can see, if he has a really good preseason and there's no hiccups along the way, I don't see why you can't pick him, but there is a big risk having had multiple restarts in Melbourne and haven't, gone quite right. But before we move to the ruck line, which we're pretty brief anyway, just one player that was brought up on on X for us was Horne-Francis. I guess that the problem here is he's only eligible as a mid rather than a mid forward. He did really well, I guess, when he came back to Port and kind of put the Demons away from North Melbourne. But as we saw, his full-time mid capabilities aren't that strong, and he plays a fair stint as a full forward, almost as a key forward, like a Dusty Martin role essentially, and that impacts his scoreline. Is there any point, do you reckon, considering this, Nathan? He's sub 500k, so I guess there's the price, maybe just not sub 500, it's 510, sorry, so early 500s, I guess. He's in that Steele and Oliver role. I'm assuming, based off what you think of the other two, you'd probably lean towards Steele or Oliver instead of Horne-Francis now that he's especially not mid-forward, or do you think he's going to recapture some of that explosiveness in that midfield that Port are pretty desperate to have, I think?
I'm a hard pass on Horne-Francis.
Yeah.
Purely because, for those of you guys that don't know, I have a couple of close friends that are North Melbourne supporters. And they finally play Port Adelaide in North Melbourne. They finally play North Melbourne in Melbourne for the first time since he basically walked out on North Melbourne. So I think, from what I've heard, I think the North Melbourne supporters are planning on giving him a lot of verbal stuff over the fence. So I would be hard avoiding him until at least round probably 2. Because I think he might have a stinker in round 1, given that he's probably going to be more worried about what's coming over the fence as opposed to actually, what's going on the field. So I think that's the factor that, is saying don't start him. But again, like Warner, if he becomes forward eligible later in the year, I think he's someone you would have to consider. Purely because, once again, the forward line is that grim. If you can get midfielders who are forward eligible, that seems to be the way that most, of those higher teams go, is they try and pick forward eligible players who play in the midfield, just for scoring wise. So, for me, it's a hard pass on Horne-Francis. But again, like Warner, if he's forward eligible later on, I would probably consider it.
Yeah, I guess that. Yeah, as you probably find out in the forward line, there's not too many premiums that look even that enticing. I know Harry Sheasel's there, but even there's question marks around his position or his best position in the North Melbourne lineup. So yeah, I think Warner and Horne-Francis, I think, become enticing again once they're forward eligible. But moving into the rucks now, there's not many players, I guess, worth talking about because the rucks, they're all pretty consistent. They haven't had really couple stinkers, but one player that really suffered in 2025 to what he's capable of. I know he averaged 111 there, it says on SuperCoach, but yeah, he's capable of a lot more is Tim English. And I think the big reason why he just really suffered last season, he had these great games, but it just seemed like he didn't read or learn how to negate that ruck rule that well, where the bigger ruckman just really dominated. He just seemed to get shoved around a lot, contest to contest. Having said that, the rules now favouring the jumpers like your English, like your Luke Jacksons, like your Tom de Connings, etc. Yeah. So do you reckon this will help English, and do you reckon that makes him a legitimate, R1 ruckman because of the adjustment of that rule and how that helps him, because he's not a bad tap ruckman either. It's not like he's just purely an athletic ruckman. But what are your thoughts, Nathan?
Yeah, I think he's the perfect R2 ruckman, to be honest.
Yeah.
I probably would be saying if you're picking him as R1, just given his price,
Mm-hmm.
which is 600,000. Yeah, I think you probably want someone higher than him. Just because I think a lot of those guys below him, unless you're going for Tom DeConning and Tim English, but I think that's a massive risk doing both of them.
Yep.
I still think you probably want one of those higher guys,
Mm-hmm.
higher than him. So I think he's a perfect R2 myself. Currently, he's actually in my classic side as R2. Obviously, I'm not a big classic player,
Yep.
but he's currently there as the second ruck. So I think he's a perfect second ruck.
Yep.
To be honest, he's someone again, much like Oliver. Had a bad year. Is probably about 50 to 60K under where he should be. So, I don't see any reason why the 111 average can't improve.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think he's really in for a big bounce back, and I think that rule's going to help him a lot more than people do think. So, in comparison to other ruckmen, and you mentioned the next player on my list, and that's TDK. You obviously have some idea have immediate family supporting the Blues, but DeConning now at the Saints, he's someone that I'm really excited to watch live with how athletic he is. He's going to tandem. Obviously, there was news that potentially in that last minute trade period, Marshall was going to leave, and that left Tom DeConning as a sole ruckman, which would have completely flipped the script on how we used to view DeConning. He's obviously one that I think Ross Lyon targeted because of that rule. I think that's partially why we got him in. He's priced accordingly. I think he has had a bit of a downer compared to his previous season, where he really did probably show the AFL world what he's capable of. Having said that, Pitney was a big reason why DeConning suffered, because Pitney basically can't play anywhere else. Obviously, you've spoken about, Nathan, that playing R1 English, R2 DeConning is a massive risk factor. But do you reckon there is any point picking DeConning with Marshall on the side? Do you reckon they're capable of playing tandem ruck, or do you reckon it's just not worth it? Obviously, he's priced cheaper, so it means you can basically utilize 100,000 elsewhere if compared to if you got, say, a Sherry or a Gorn. But what are your thoughts on DeConning? Because I know he's very capable of scoring, consistent 120s when he's playing salt ruck.
Yeah, I think. Look, I think I would kind of write last year off for DeConning, to be honest. I think it became apparent very sort of towards that mid part of the season that he was leaving, and I think he sort of just fell out of love a bit, perhaps with Carlton. So perhaps he wasn't putting in his 100% best. He was too busy thinking about all the fat money that he's now on. So perhaps with it again, perhaps with that change of environment, he's at a club that seemed to have invested in him. To the point where they were going to essentially trade out their their well-established ruckman for him. So I think that's a massive tick for sort of his place in the side. Is in the Ross Lyon sees a future with him. I guess the only question I have about him is that Warren Marshall situation. Obviously, I think if St Kilda got what they wanted, and or if Warren Marshall got what he wanted, which was to leave, I think this would be a lay down misère to have English and DeConning as R1 and R2. But because of that Marshall situation, the fact that they're both there, perhaps it is a bit of a, could he be impacted again like he was last year with Mark Pidney? So I think perhaps it's a watch list for me at this stage, just until I have a bit more clarity about his role and how Rowan Marshall's going to impact his role. Because I think for Tom DeConning to be a viable ruck option, I think he probably needs to be the number one ruck.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure if that's going to be the case with Warren Marshall being in the side, because I think they're both quite capable ruckmen. So, yeah, I think there's some question marks perhaps over his scoring consistency. So at this stage, it's a no for me for De Koning, but he probably will end up on a watch list. Because obviously you can't deny he's got talent.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And before we move on the forward line, I guess this one is arguably the briefest of the lot. I just thought he'd be a somewhat of a relevant pick because he's a pod every year at some stage, and that goes to, if I can get his name, Toby Nankervis. So 2 years ago, he was averaging 110, looked really, really dominant, was a genuine pod option for a large chunk of the 2024 season. Didn't score nowhere near as well last year. Went from a 110 average to a 98 average. Look, obviously, the Tigers are a very, very young group, and I think a big reason of why he didn't score well was because of that and how that impacts his hit outs to advantage and his stuff around the ground and opposition players reading Nank's ruck tups better than his own players. Do you reckon he's a viable pod option? Obviously, with the fact that, you look at, if I just get rid of his name, Gorn 689, Sherry 687, and Grundy 677. And then there's a big jump to Luke Jackson and Darcy Cameron at the low 600 mark. And you've got Nank, who is capable of matching them at a price which is at 529, so you're saving another almost 100k. Do you reckon it's viable? Because that could mean that you upgrade someone like a Young or a Parish to all of a sudden a Goulden or whatever, or do you reckon that's not worth the risk, and the gap between, say, a Nank and a Sherry's just too big?
Well, I think if you're going to go Nank, I think I would feel much safer with the person sitting there R2 who's cheaper again than Nank. So
Yep.
I think that's probably as much as I need to say on that. I think Tom De Koning is the reason why the reason why this ruck rule was brought in, so that it allowed people like De Koning to show their athletic skill. And Nankervis is probably someone who did benefit from, the more wrestle type rules. So yeah, I think if you're gonna toss that up, I think I would much rather go with Tristan Cherry, or someone like that over Nank. And then the fact that Tom De Koning is cheaper and he's someone who is probably definitely going to benefit from this new rule. I think unfortunately for Nank, I think he's probably not in my considerations for this year.
No, I don't think he's in many people's considerations with how set and forget rucks have been in the past. So moving now to the forward line. Now, the forward line is a bit of a minefield. You look at the top priced player at 580k, that's Harry Sheasel, then it drops significantly to Nick Martin. Would have been a very good option, but he's done his ACL. We got Petrarca in there, which we could have talked about here, but new club and a new situation. Who knows with the track? We've talked about him briefly last episode. Isaac Rankin was one that was brought to my attention on X, that he was not necessarily one that had a shit year to his standards and had a bad average in SuperCoach. He actually went up from a 96 to a 99. I guess the caveat with Rankin is that he fluctuates so much in price that you look at him and say, oh, he's a great price at whatever it is, 439k, but you can easily get him at 100k cheaper because he's very capable of putting out those stinkers. My question to you, Nathan, I think this is from a positional standpoint to Rankin, because as soon as he plays a small forward, half forward role, that's when his score shits the bed. But if he can play through the midfield a lot more consistently, that makes it a lot more enticing. Do you reckon he'll get that opportunity at the Crows next season, or do you reckon he plays his best footy as that small forward who pushes up?
Look, it hurts me to say this because of obviously being a Collingwood supporter, but I would be, if he can remove the fact he's not playing in round one, I think he's a jump on, because we saw how badly Adelaide missed him in that final series. I think I was messaging Thomas off camera and said that basically Adelaide scored, I think they were averaging about 2 goals a game from forward 50 stoppages across the home and away season, which was by far and away the best in the league. Yeah. And then I think against Collingwood, they scored 1 point, and against Hawthorn, they didn't score at all. if from their forward 50 stoppages. So, yeah, I think Rankin will play that midfield role again, who will go forward at stoppages. So I can see that average climbing again.
Yep.
I guess you sort of get what you pay for. Yes, he's going to have his, odd bad game, but yeah, can see him being a full-time midfielder. So I think if that's the case, I think that is probably a good buy at that price. I think it's probably him and Cheezel and Petrarca who are fighting for my F1 and maybe F2 at the minute. I don't think Nick Martin's not an option, and I don't really like having key forwards in SuperCoach. I just think that they fluctuate more than anyone. So I think, from my perspective, it's probably Sheasel, Rankin, and Petrarca who are fighting for those two forward spots at the minute.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Rankin is someone who should be strongly considered.
Yeah, I think he's almost a blessing in disguise that he's going to miss round one. I think. I wouldn't. Well, I reckon it'll go one or two ways. He'll come with a fire in his belly and dominate the first couple rounds, and I guess everyone jumps on then, or he just shits the bed and doesn't play as well, nowhere near as well as he should. But having said that, I think a big reason why the Crows went out in straight sets was because Rankin wasn't there. He's such an X factor. And I think with how bad the forward line is, with there's only a few premium options, it's going to be really important if Rankin does start well, that you jump on at the right time, because I said, again, he fluctuates in price, and I think you're probably kicking yourself a little bit if you pick him up at almost his highest point and then he drops 100k and then all of a sudden you've just wasted that money. So I think he's a big wait and see with how he responds after his suspension. But moving on to the next player, there's not too many left now that are really worth talking about. But if I just grab my photo up here, we obviously talked about Sam Flanders in detail in my team picker. Just pick him. I think he's going to be the highest owned percentage player going around. He's going from having a really good stint at the Suns and then dropping quite significantly away just with the emergence of their midfield group. I think he's going to slot seamlessly into that midfield, but he's not the one I'm talking about today. This is another or different player, key forward. So this goes against everything Nathan just said. Harry Mackay, he's one that averages quite well as a key forward, because he gets high up the ground as a marking forward, a leading forward, and plays second ruck sometimes. Averaged 86.3 with a lot of the season with no Curnow. Now Curno's completely not there, and someone we'll talk about in a little bit. But what are your thoughts on Mackay? Because, look, the Blues really need to bounce back this season if Voss wants to have a job and the Blues fans want to keep their sanity. But what are your thoughts on Mackay? Is any thought of picking him? He's 466k, which is a very awkward price because you want him to be a keeper or hold as much as possible because he's not really a stepping stone. I guess with the expensive price tag for a key forward, you're probably looking elsewhere, Nathan.
Yes, he's a pass for me at this stage. Although if he can become Carlton's second ruck, consistently, then perhaps I might reconsider that. Because I think that's the only way I would really consider key forwards is if they can also ruck. I guess he's now the leader of that forward line, so there's going to be that extra, I guess, expectation on him. And we have seen in the past that his kicking at goal has been very suspect at times. So, look, at this stage, it's no for me. But I definitely will perhaps sort of keep my eye on him and see what his ruck time is, because I think that's the only way I would consider him, basically.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think it'll be also an interesting watch to see how he works without Curnow. I mean, with Curnow, it seemed Curnow played the deeper of the two, and that allowed Mackay to move a lot higher up the ground, take those contested marks, and be able to float back I know Tim Membry did it at St Kilda when the time's low. He moves back down to try and defend a game, and he can get some cheap intercepts marks there. But I would assume that this might not be possible now that he's playing the sole forward. Liam Reedy's obviously going to be playing for the Blues, and I reckon a fair chunk of the season. So whether or not they do go Liam Reedy and Pitney, then all of a sudden Mackay's playing key forward. So I think if Mackay's role doesn't get too heavily impacted by the departure of Curnow, then I think he's one to watch for sure. And if you can get him, grab him at, if he does drop to say 350, 400 throughout the season, he definitely does become a cheap F6. But moving on to his essential partner of crime at the Blues, and someone we just spoke about was Charlie Curnow. He gets a fresh start at the Swans, and I think will bounce back quite nicely. Average 69.7 at the Blues, but that was heavily injury impacted at times. Do you reckon he's going to change his career around a little bit at the Swans? And do you reckon he could be one to watch that simply because he might get a better ball servicing? Because I know that the Blues ball entries into inside 50 were near on horrendous, but the Sydney Swans look a lot more capable of doing so.
Yeah, well, I will sort of go a bit from blast from the past here and say that the only key forward that I think I ever considered in SuperCoach was Lance Franklin.
Yep.
And that was purely because not only was he a great kicker goal and he could lead that forward line, but he was also a great field kick who could get up the field as well. Now, I see a lot of Franklin in Charlie Curnow, in that he's sort of the same type of player, maybe not as physically built as Franklin, but we've seen him do it at Carlton. He can lead the forward line. He's a great field kick. I guess for him, the biggest difference is going to be what's his work rate like. I know a lot of Carlton supporters were frustrated with him. Basically, if he didn't get his way or the ball didn't go to him, he wouldn't do anything outside of that. So I don't think that's going to be tolerated at Sydney. I think he's going to have to do more than that. So, if he can get, if he can get to that sort of, I don't think anyone's ever going to repeat Lance Franklin. I think he's just a, freak of nature. But if he can do a sort of similar role, I can see that 69 average climbing up into the 80s or the 90s, which then all of a sudden makes him a viable option. So I think if you are going to break that key forward thing that I have, I think this is the only one I would consider purely for that reason.
Yeah, I think the other key forward, Jamara Ugle-Hagan, who's 100k cheaper, but we spoke about that last episode. But there's only, a couple. He's priced at a high 300, so I guess there is that risk that it goes pear-shaped and then you're stuck with who to go for. But the next three names are in that lower bracket bar one. Before we talk about the last two, because I know you got a vested interest in one, Nathan, the next person is Dylan Moore. He's one that, look, he was really impressive when he started to blow up when Hawthorn essentially got better. I think he played a crucial role in the midfield when they were kind of rising up the ranks. Now he's kind of been sent back into the high half forward line and pushing in as another fourth midfielder. You got Josh Ward, who's impressed a lot since his kind of resurgence. Will Days, when he's fit, he's going to be in there. Jai Newcomb plays his best footy in the midfield. Is there any merit in picking Dylan Moore? Because we know what he's capable of, but I think this year in particular, last season, we saw a lot of the time where he's 40s and 50s because he was playing that small high half forward. What are your thoughts on Moore? Is he just a no-go, or do you reckon with the state of the forward line as it is, that it could be worth picking as a punt?
No, I don't think I would go near him.
Yeah. Short and sweet.
I think, yeah, I don't think he's. Look, I think Hawthorn still a midfielder short of being a true competitor. Yes, they made a prelim final, but there were circumstances in that. The Giants were seen are very flaky when it comes to finals, and Adelaide, obviously, we saw them. Even though they finished on top, Adelaide, I don't think they were a true. Side who were that far clear of everyone else. So, and then they played Geelong and they stayed with Geelong for a half and then they, fell away a bit. So, look, I think if he gets hot, you would pick him up, but I don't think I would start with him.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't start with him. He's not a player that consistently starts well. He's one that basically has a 5 to 6 period where he averages about 120, and that's when you try and jump on. But I wouldn't bother starting with him. But to finish off the episode, I know we're reaching that hour mark. Is two players that around that 300k mark that I know Nathan was basically saying earlier in the episode to go against players that are injury prone, but I guess we'll get our 2 cents worth whilst we're here. Is first of all Jordan De Goey, which I'll let Nathan talk about in a minute, and Adam Treloar, obviously both heavily impacted by injury. Treloar more so than the other. De Goey, I think, in my opinion, it was a big reason why Collingwood's season was derailed slightly. Was De Goey's form wasn't there, and I think he's really important at midfield mix. He does play some of his best footy up forward, but I think he provides that explosiveness that Collingwood looks so good in. I think Dacos is one person that provides that explosive running power, but other than that, you got Pendlebury, who's a workhorse. You got Ned Long, who's a real workhorse. You don't really have anyone that has that real burst of strong pace to go inside 50. I'm assuming you're pretty keen on picking De Goey at 320k, Nath.
Yeah, I am. And that's purely because, so obviously, being a Collingwood supporter, I do follow him. He hasn't missed a session all summer, which is vital for him because the last two pre-seasons he's been impacted by injury. But this pre-season, so far he hasn't missed one. He looks fit. He looks strong. He's just become a father for the first time. So, there's something away from football for him. I just think it's all coming together for him. And the fact that he's forward eligible makes it even stronger consideration. That I think with the forward line being so grim, that I think if you are going to take a punt on these sort of mid-price risks, I think it's going to be in the forward line. And I think De Goey fits the bill perfectly.
Yeah, no, I do agree. He's a good flex position if you don't want to do a Sam Draper, as what we talked about last week. But I think if he can find his form quickly come match day, he's going to be one to watch. And he's got a favourable-ish fixture in St Kilda who don't really tag too heavily. Like I would assume Windhag goes to Dacos come opening round. But I guess on the flip side, and we'll talk about this more when the official SuperCoach comes, and it's usually around Australia Day, or towards the end of Jan, that you just want to be careful of how many buy players you're picking. It used to be it was only the interstate teams and the big teams, but now you've got that Collingwood St Kilda game in there, so that you've got Naz, Sinclair, Philippou, Flanders,
Dacos, De Goey.
That's already half a team there that you got to be careful of. So it'll be interesting to see what people go with because, this will be a first time in a while. There's a lot of popular players from, so few teams that could really impact the start of the season. But before we wrap it up, we'll touch very briefly on Treloar because we talked about him a bit more in detail last season. Obviously, he had a wretched run with injury. He's known for his soft tissue problems. I remember he basically blew out both his hamstrings in one game. So he's known for his real soft tissue impacts or his soft tissue injury, sorry. But having said that, if he does get through a full preseason, he's one that can't really play anywhere else in the midfield. How do you think he's going to return to footy, Nathan? Obviously, I think he did quite well in the VFL. He played in their I don't know if they won the premiership or not, but they definitely played in a final at least. But do you reckon that when he comes back, it's almost like the speed of the game's gone past him? Or do you reckon, having watched him at Collingwood, do you reckon he can come back into the midfield and really complement the likes of Liberatore, Bontempelli, Ed Richards? Like, there's a big list to go in there. Do you reckon he even gets a spot in there?
Well, yes, I think he gets a spot in there. Unfortunately for Adam, he was my favourite player when he was at Collingwood, and unfortunately he's never been the same since he did his double hamstring strain against Carlton on the wing at the MCG. He's never been the same player since that point in time. So, look, I don't think I can go down that path again.
Yeah.
With Treloar, especially if you're going to pick, say, a Darcy Parish in the midfield. and then you're going to pick the goalie as well.
Yep.
And then you're going to pick Nick Newman as well. I think there comes a tipping point where you perhaps have to look past one of those injury-prone players. So at this stage, I think Treloar's probably the one who I would look over. Just because a lot of his issues seem to be the same recurrence of a soft tissue injury. Whereas I think Darcy Parish's is more muscular, and I think the goalie's problems are more muscular as well. Whereas there's genuine, concern when you start getting repeat soft tissue injuries because they are a lot easier to ping again once they go, essentially. So, I think for that, out of that sort of group of injury prone players, I think at this stage, Treloar's the one I wouldn't be picking.
Yeah, look, if Treloar was 5 years younger, maybe, but he's definitely pushing on the other side of 30. So, I think Treloar would be probably the one to go. I know he's averaged very high, but his disposal efficiency was never the best anyway. So, I think, you look at how many 300k players you want to pick, and Parish and Young in particular look almost like locks at this stage in the season. Preseason. But time will tell in how Treloar fits in that mix. But that's all we got time for today. We're pretty much at the hour mark anyway. As we said on Twitter or X, there's a part 2 coming out in a few weeks' time, and we'll look at the players who not necessarily are looking for a redemption arc, but are ready to push into that next level of category where you're looking to pick them, like Josh Wards and whatnot, that had a really good 20 or back end of 2025 or a good season where they were priced at more of a mid-pricer, and you think, hang on, there's some value here I can jump on, and they can really push into the next step. Next episode, I posted a couple days ago on X and Instagram and our other socials. If you would like to send through an iteration of your preseason team, doesn't have to be the final team, obviously, but we're happy to review those teams. We had a few sent in so far, so we'll spend an episode looking at how you're building your team, and it'll be interesting to see what the similarities and differences are earlier in the season, where people start to be a little bit creative before it gets into the nitty-gritty side of the season. But other than that, we'll catch you for our team review episode next week.